Welcome, everyone. Okay, I want to welcome everyone to the Descendants of Jesuit Enslavement live stream of our regular Thursday calls. Tonight, we have a guest speaker with us. Also, if you're following us on YouTube and you're in the chat, welcome. Tonight's guest speaker is Rachel L. Swarns. Rachel is a journalism professor at New York University and contributing writer for the New York Times. She is the author of American Tapestry, the story of the Black, white, and multiracial ancestors of Michelle Obama, and co-author of Unseen, Unpublished Black History from the New York Times Photo Archives. And tonight she is joining us to discuss her new book, The 272. So again, welcome, Rachel. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, and thank you for being here with us. We're looking forward to discussing your book with us and the rest of America, everyone else who's watching us here on YouTube. Just a little bit about my connection to you. I don't know if you remember this, but I first remember you, I guess that would be August 30th, 2016. You reached out to me because you were going to have a story coming out the next morning and you wanted my reaction. And I remember getting into the Uber, heading to the airport on September 1st and responding to you. And apparently you updated your story with my response online. And by the time I landed in Washington, D.C., my phone was just blowing up. My social media was blowing up because reporters from all over wanted to hear my comments. Thank you. Thank you so much. Just a moment, Clarence. For some reason, we can't see you. Okay. All right, Rachel. Again, thank you. Thank you so much for being with us. I know I asked you to read a selection from your book, and then we'll go right into Q&A. Oh, Rachel, you're on mute. We can't hear you.
Hard to hear if I'm on mute. Sorry about that. I just wanted to thank you, Karen, for inviting me today to speak about the book. And it is just, and just to everyone in the room, I just want to thank all of you. I have spoken and met some of you in the past, some of you I haven't, but it has been, a real privilege to do this reporting and this research about the 272 and about the descendants of the people who were enslaved by the Jesuits. I feel like it's a really important part of our history, and it has been a real privilege for me to do this work. So I just wanted to say that first of all. I thought what I might do is actually read a couple of paragraphs from where I started, from that first article I wrote in April of 2016, and then a couple of paragraphs from the book, so you can kind of see a little bit of the journey. So the first few paragraphs are from that article, which many of you are familiar with. The human cargo was loaded on ships at a bustling wharf near the nation's capital, destined for the plantations of the Deep South. Some slaves pleaded for rosaries as they were rounded up, praying for deliverance. But on this day, in the fall of 1838, no one was spared. Not the 2-month-old baby and her mother, not the field hands, not the shoemaker, and not Cornelius Hawkins, who was about 13 years old when he was forced on board. Their panic and desperation would be mostly forgotten for more than a century. But this was no ordinary slave sale. The enslaved African Americans had belonged to the nation's most prominent Jesuit priests, and they were sold along with scores of others to help secure the future of the premier Catholic institution of higher learning at the time, known today as Georgetown University. So that's the first couple of paragraphs from that story that I wrote back then, and now I'll read you a few from the book. Today, the Catholic Church is the largest religious denomination in the United States, with more than 60 million members, more than 19,000 parishes, and enormous influence in the nation's political, cultural, educational, and religious life. Americans often view it as a northern institution that has welcomed, educated, and nurtured waves of newcomers from Europe and Latin America. But there is a darker history, both for the church and for our country. For more than a century, the American Catholic Church relied on the buying, selling, and enslavement of Black people to lay its foundations, support its clergy, and drive its expansion. Without the enslaved, the Catholic Church in the United States, as we know it today, would not exist. The priests in Maryland, who relied on the proceeds derived from slave labor and slavery, built the nation's first Catholic college, the first archdiocese, and the first Catholic cathedral, and helped establish 2 of the earliest Catholic monasteries. Even the clergymen who established the first Catholic seminary operated a plantation and relied on enslaved laborers. The priests prayed for the salvation of the souls of the people they held captive, even as they sold their bodies. And that's the short reading that I wanted to do from the book.
Well, thank you. What made you choose that particular passage from the book?
You know, when I first got started, of course, I first of all, I'm Black, I'm Catholic. I had no idea that priests were involved in the slave trade. I had no idea. And so I knew about Georgetown, and it just seemed incredible to me that this had happened. And so I was very focused on that. But as time passed, I realized, as all of you know very well, that it is not just Georgetown, and that it was the very root. It was the very underpinnings of the Catholic Church that we were talking about here. So I chose those 2 because it kind of shows you where I started and kind of where I ended up.
Well, the book really reads like a novel. It's very easy reading, and so I definitely encourage everyone to get the book and read it, and even listen to the audio. The lady who reads it on Audible, her voice is very soothing. But I want to back up to when you first became aware of this story. I know for many of us, we found out with your article, the April 2016 article in the New York Times. Can you tell us a little bit about when you were first made aware of this story?
Yes. So back in the fall of 2015, students at Georgetown staged protests. They were concerned about the names of the priests, 2 of the early presidents being on campus buildings. They wanted those names removed. The university had already established a working group, to try and wrestle with this history. And so they agreed to take those names off the building. They had been thinking about doing something like that anyway. And the protest caught the attention of a Georgetown alum who many of you know, Richard Cellini, who happened to be running a tech company, and read about this from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and just asked the question, well, okay, we got some protests, we got some names on buildings, but we've got this 272, and who are they, and what happened to them? And he reached out to a faculty member, someone who was on this working group that Georgetown had established. And that faculty member told him that everyone had died. All of them had died. and Richard was like, all of them, 300 people, all of them had died. And he just didn't believe it. And Richard is, as you know, is a white guy he's a Republican. He's someone who hadn't been involved in racial justice issues. But he loved Georgetown, and something about this felt really wrong to him. He felt like the institution owes itself to these folks, and shouldn't we know who they are? And so he hired a team of genealogists and started, trying to find out, like, are there descendants? What happened to them? And then he reached out to the New York Times. He didn't reach out to me initially. He reached out to someone he knew, a business reporter, who he had been in touch with before because, again, he ran a tech company. And so he contacted her and said, hey, I got an exclusive for the New York Times about a slave sale in 1838 that benefited Georgetown. And she was kind of like, okay, well, because you have to remember that, this was before the 1619 project. Ta-Nehisi Coates had written his very famous piece, Case for Reparations. But, this kind of work wasn't something that was typical for a newspaper to do. And so, she was intrigued but uncertain. And, I always say to people, life is just, you never know. Like, if it's just my enormous great fortune that she just didn't delete that email and just say, that's 19th century stuff. What does that have to do with the New York Times today? But she didn't. She remembered that there was someone on the staff who she thought might know a little bit about this and could tell whether it was a story or not. I had written a book that traced Michelle Obama's ancestors back to the 1800s. And so she knew I had some familiarity with archival research and with 19th century American slavery. And so she forwarded the email to me. And as soon as I saw that email, I knew it was a story. My work on Michelle Obama's ancestors had allowed me to explore how slavery shaped American families. And I knew immediately that this was going to be, for me, kind of the next step in the work that I wanted to do, which was to examine how slavery shaped an elite American institution. And so, I got started, and, my idea too was, 272 people, many of you know that if you're writing about slavery or talking about slavery, that, there are a lot of people who are going to say, no, thank you, not interested, long time ago, nothing to do with me. And so I felt like there was an urgency to me, like this felt urgent to me. I know it's 19th century, but it felt urgent to me. And I wanted to find a way to stop people from doing that. I wanted to find a way to make people keep reading. And I thought, okay, there are 272 people. I'm going to tell the story of one. And I'm going to tell the story of a boy, a 13-year-old boy, because who can't relate to a child being torn away from the world he knows, his family? Who can't relate to that? And so that was my aim, is to try and tell the story of one child's journey, and his journey, from, the 19th century to the descendant on the other side in the 21st century. And that's how I got started.
And so when you decided that you were going to tell the story of a boy, a 13-year-old boy, that's not exactly the story you told, right? It's not just one person. So when you first wrote about this for the New York Times,
are you talking about for the? Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, when you first wrote the article, well, because you wrote several articles for the New York Times. when you first wrote those articles for the New York Times, did you know then that you would be writing a book also?
No, no. I did because again, because of the work I had done before, and because really because of the work I had done before, I joke with people that when I did that work, it was the first time I had done archival research like that on slavery or on anything. And again, it felt to me again like this urgency of telling these stories. So I thought it was possible that there might be one, but you never know. You never know what's going to be of interest to people. I thought it was certainly interesting enough, but my main focus was kind of writing these stories. So I wrote that first one. And one of the things that was really important too in the beginning was, you know, by the time the first story ran, Richard and his nonprofit, the Georgetown Memory Project, had identified about a handful of descendants, and we all knew that certainly there were more. And so we wanted to try to help people, to help find more people, to help connect people to this history. And so we linked to the passenger list of the Catherine Jackson, because that document actually had first and last names. And you know that enslaved people often are just described by first names. So it's a very, very useful and valuable record. And we just asked readers, we said, do you recognize anyone on this list? Do you have family in Maringouin? Are you Black and Catholic from Southern Maryland? We want to hear your stories. And scores of people wrote to us. And, we began trying to connect people, figure it out. Judy Riffle, many of you know from the Georgetown Memory Project. Adam Rothman, also on his side, was also trying to do this work. So it kind of just kept growing and growing and growing, as time went by.
I remember the the April 2016 article mentioned the Hawkins family. And I'm like, well, my husband's grandma,
right.
Hawkins, and it mentioned the town Maringouin, Louisiana. I'm like, my father-in-law was born in Maringouin, Louisiana. I said, we have to be a part of this. And I did reach out to Judy, and she mentioned that not only was he a Hawkins, he's a Butler also. And then a couple of years later, we found out that Bibiana Butler was actually Bibiana Mahoney, his ancestor. And I imagine that
Anna Mahoney, right?
Yes. I imagine many people found out, and it's my hope through this call, your book, and other outreach, even more people out there in the world will figure out that they too are a descendant of someone who was enslaved by the Jesuits, whether through this sale or other sales in Maryland, or just period through Jesuit enslavement.
That's right.
And I just want to
enslavement, yes.
Yes, that's why our group is called Descendants of Jesuit Enslavement. And for everyone who is viewing this on YouTube, we are a group that has been meeting weekly for the last 3 years, all through the pandemic, actually. And the work that we do is we're mostly people who have a DNA connection to someone who is a known descendant, or who know through their family research that they are known descendants. And we just try to figure out how we're connected to each other and to this history. And we meet every single Thursday, unless there's a hurricane or something. I'm here in New Orleans, so sometimes the weather affects our meeting. And the group has been solid for these last 3 years, every week. And so that just shows the commitment. So if there are other people out there who have done their DNA, we primarily look at the DNA on Ancestry, because they have the largest DNA database. But if you've done your DNA and you're finding that you are related to some of the families connected to the Georgetown Memory Project, or through some of the surnames that are associated with this history, feel free to reach out to us on social media. That's Descendants of Jesuit Enslavement on all manner of social media, or even through the contact on YouTube. And so if you have a question, if you're in the YouTube chat, please put a Q first and then put your question, and we'll have someone monitor the chat for questions. And then our group that's on Zoom, our regular group, they already know to send me their questions. So some of our questions might be more technical than the questions you normally get as you've been sharing the story of the 272, because we're researchers, and some of us are descendants and are related to descendants, so we might have more information than others. So our questions might get a little more technical. Just a fair warning.
Absolutely.
A fair warning.
That's okay. That's okay. And I wanted to jump into something that you had mentioned, which was that, so it's been 7 years, right? So it's been quite a journey for me. And, when I first got started, the focus was kind of 1838 and the sale to Louisiana. And as time went on, and as I did more research, and then I realized, oh, wait, not just Georgetown, wait, it's the Catholic Church, not just Louisiana. It's all of these families who were enslaved and remained in Maryland. Not just that 1838 slave sale, but lots of slave sales all the way through, smaller ones, but, still devastating ones for families. So it really has been a learning process for me as I've gotten deeper and deeper, and I know that there's still more, there's still more to learn and still more research to be done.
How long did it take you to research for this book?
So I think it was in July of 2016 that I was approached. I actually ended up with a contract with a publishing house, and so that year I didn't actually, I kind of started doing the research little by little. I was still working full time at the Times. And then in January of 2017, I took a leave, which was supposed to be a 2-year leave, and I was supposed to get everything done in that time. And then NYU offered me a job and said, listen, if you love the 19th century and you want to spend the rest of your career in the 19th century, come and do it here. Hold on for a second. I'm so sorry. This is life when you've got someone's ringing my doorbell. Hold on.
Not a problem.
So then I was teaching and researching and writing. And then the pandemic hit. So there have been lots of bumps and changes along the way. I turned in the manuscript about a year ago. We're in June, a little more than that, maybe. And by then, I had a sense of what the whole was. But even then, I still was kept working, because you have time, there are revisions, and you're reworking things. And so, I look at it and say it was about 7 years in all, the research and writing.
And related to that process, and the guest, do you want to ask your question, or do you want me to ask your question? If you want to ask your question, you can come off of mute and ask it.
Sure, I'll ask. Hi, Rachel. My name's Nagast Rucker. I'm a descendant of Louisa Mahoney. It's great to be with you. I just wanted to ask what your research process was like.
It's a really good question. I mean, and most of you in this room know, and maybe some of the folks who are viewing know that if you're writing about enslaved people, it's difficult because enslaved people by law and by practice were typically barred from learning to read or write. So the letters and journals and stuff aren't there. So really, when I got started, I knew, as many of you know, you're following the enslaver, right? You're following um, the white person who enslaved people, because usually that's where the records are. And so the first thing I did actually was I found out that there were these catalogs that the Jesuits put out, sometimes year by year, sometimes decade by decade. I can't actually remember the frequency of them, but they actually listed all of the priests and where they were stationed at any given time. So I started there because I wanted to know the names of the priests who were stationed at the plantations. And once I knew that, then I could go and look priest by priest by priest for the record, any what any letters that they wrote, any records that were related to them from the Jesuit archive. So that's really where I started, was just trying to find the priests on the plantations and the records they left behind, to see what it said about, kind of what they said about slavery, about slave sales, about the people, the families who lived there. So that's where I started. And then, I was looking for, I had kind of a two-pronged process. So I was looking, researching in the past, but also I was, reporting and researching with the people today too, right? Talking to people about what they knew about their families, what kind of family stories they had heard, what records they had to. My idea was, I very much, because as I went along, as I mentioned, I realized, okay, wait, there are these families who stayed in Maryland. There are families that were broken up. I was interested in those. So the families that were broken up, particularly, I wanted to be able to write about families that stayed in Maryland and what happened to those that ended up in Louisiana. But anyway, that's where I started. And then, there's so many records, that I ended up relying on. There's some sacramental records in Baton Rouge. Judy Riffle actually introduced me to the Archdiocese of Baton Rouge, where they have some sacramental records, which are helpful. The Jesuits have some too. Then they also, in the Jesuit archive, they have some very specific records about particular plantations too. Like there's they call it like I forget the exact name. It was like kind of a cash rent / blacksmith book that's focused on St. Inigo's for a period of time, which was a really interesting document. I was also looking for, because you want to hear the voices of the people, and Karen, thank you for saying that it reads like a novel. I very much, again, want this to be a history that's accessible to people, that people would want to read. Again, I know that there are people who don't want to read about slavery, so I want to bring people in. And the way, again, I thought about, one child for that first story, right? Weaving in other people too. And with this, I thought the same thing. I'll focus on one family, weaving other families in the book as well, but that would allow people to kind of follow the arc. So in choosing, people say, well, why the Mahonies? Why not the Hawkinses, the Butlers, the Gows, the Goffs, all of the families? And truly, honestly, you could write, there are books there, like I said, there are many, many books to be written still. For me, what I had to do was, given the paucity of records, was focus on a family where I could find the most records. And because the Mahoneys had sued the Jesuits in the late 1700s, there was a way to I don't know if any of you have looked at those, that lawsuit, but Will Thomas has written a very fine book that deals with some of those, that specific period. He's the Queens and the Mahoneys, and the lawsuits were particularly helpful as records, because these were people alive in the 1700s who, Black and white, who remembered the matriarch and what she had said. And so it allowed me to, tell the story almost from, the priests arrive in Maryland in 1634 and Anne Joyce arrives, decades later, like in the 1600s. The family story kind of parallels the emergence of Catholicism in the colonies and in the United States. But truly, it was those lawsuits and the fact that she was determined to keep the oral history alive, and that oral history, that story, they themselves kept their story alive, and that helped too. So anyway, we could talk more about records, but one last thing I would say, which was a really great record, and it's not, in fact, a Mahoney record at all, but was just a fantastic one, is the Civil War pension records, which, because for the families who ended up in Louisiana, a number of those men joined the Union Army. None of the Mahoneys did, but a number of those men joined the Union Army. And those Civil War pension records are fantastic because they have affidavits from the people themselves. The soldier sometimes, if they applied for a pension for the government during his lifetime, or the wife, they will often say where they were enslaved. They talk a little bit about their lives. Those were fantastic records, and allowed me to kind of paint a little bit of a portrait of what life was like, on that side of things in Louisiana.
And just on the same theme, and I was going to ask the question about why the Mahoney. So I'm so glad that you answered that question, because just in doing this work, we can easily see there's so many stories among the
there are many books here. Many.
And so well, we know, and I'm sure you know, that there were more than 300 people in the sale. Why did you settle on the title, the 272, and what also led into using the photo of Frank Campbell on the cover?
It's funny because I have a footnote about the 272, because there were more than 272. And, but, I was trying to, I wanted a title that, that signaled Georgetown, and the GU 272 by then had become, a powerful, people knew who the 272 were. The students did that, right? The students in 2015, said, hashtag GU 272. And, it became something that was a recognizable signifier of this particular history. And so that's why I stuck with the 272, even though the story is so much bigger than the 272. One thing I would say too is that I realized is that scholars of this of Jesuit slaveholding, and there are obviously, I'm not the first at all to do it. There's a Thomas Murphy, a Jesuit priest, wrote a book, Jesuit slaveholding. They came out in the early 2000s. Robert Curran, Georgetown historian, has written important articles, and and some of his books deal with this history, really important stuff. But a lot of the discussion was about slave sales was that the Jesuits, until 1838, that the Jesuits didn't really sell for profit, that, they sold, rebellious people, people who, were, unruly or difficult in some way. But the truth is, when I say it's not just the 272, it's there were these other slave sales. That's not true at all. They did sell people for profit all along the way. And one of the quotes that is so striking, and I talk about this at every talk I go to, is Archbishop Carroll in 1805, where he had some expenses that he needed to pay down from the plantations. And the quote is that they could make up this money with the sale of a few unnecessary Negroes. I mean, so it's it's not just the 272. It's not, and it's certainly not just the Mahonies.
Lynn, now would be a good time for you to ask your question.
Hi, Rachel. It's nice to see you again. I'm Lynn Nehemiah, and I'm a descendant of Louisa as well. And I actually have two questions. One is I was curious to know what areas did you find that you were doing your revisions in? And the second question I have is, what has been the reaction to some of the white Catholics? I'm just curious if you've gotten much response from them around this.
So, yeah. So, for us as journalists, we often say, like, writing is revising. Like, so my process was actually, and it's so interesting because at first because I started with that first story with 1838, when I was thinking about how to start, I had 1838 in my head, and someone said, no, you know what? For your first draft, don't do that. Write a chronological draft, just of everything you have. Don't even worry if it's any good. Just write a chronological draft. And somehow that opened up something for me. Because if I was starting at the beginning, then I was starting in 1634, and that changed everything, So my first draft, I wrote from 1634 to 1910, roughly. I had to make some decisions about, like, where would this story end? 1910. I decided the two sisters, Louisa and Anna, because I wanted, I was going to focus on a family that was torn apart. So I decided that I would end with the deaths of the sisters. But so I just wrote a chronological draft, and then, which took a while. And then I looked at that and said, okay, and actually that's my favorite part of writing, is when you have, to me, the scariest thing is the blank screen. But if I've got a lot of words, even if they're bad, not great, then I can do something with it. So then I took that draft and said, okay, this is what I have. Now, how do I want to make this into a story? So I changed lots and lots of things as I was trying to think about the structure. I'll give you a good example. A good example of one thing I changed was, initially, I had a chapter about the church itself that was later in the book. I tried to kind of compile everything about the church itself in a chapter about the church. But when I looked at that, it just didn't work, because the church, there was so much about the church, both in terms of the early period. I really felt like we had to deal with the early period of, even what happened before the priests arrived, how Rome wrestled with the issue of enslavement as Europeans went into Africa and came into the Americas, all through the 18th and 19th centuries. And so that was one change I made. I said, you know what, it's actually it's got to be kind of seamless. I've got to tell the story of the church as I'm telling the story of this family. So that's one thing that I changed. But there were many, many things. In terms of white Catholics, It's interesting. I did a show just this evening called Busted Halo. It's a serious radio show run by a Catholic priest. And he said that, you know, he thought it was an important subject, but he knew that a lot of his audience was saying, oh no, you know, like, why are we going there? That's a long time ago. What does it have to do with us? And, you know, what good comes of any of this? And, you know, so I think there is that out there. You know, I'm still in early days because the book just came out last week. So we'll see kind of what it will, you know, what the reaction is going to be like. I mean, some people have you know, I do get emails like that, you know, like, you know, you're attacking the church and, you know, enough already. Everybody, you know, the people say, oh, well, what about you know, Africans enslaved people? So, you know, what's the big deal? People say, oh, you know, the Irish, when they came, were almost treated like slaves. You know, I got an email from someone saying, you know, all the Irish who died in the Civil War, you know, they paid the price for freedom, and that's all you know, you what are you guys talking about in terms of acknowledging or reparations that they, you know? And so we'll see. But you know, but there are also people who, you know, I think really want to wrestle with it, you know. So I think it's a little all over the map, and you know, it's early.
Thanks, Rachel. I just want to go back. I think I might have asked too long of a question regarding the photo of Frank Campbell.
Oh, that's right. You did ask that. So we there are so first of all, when that photo was discovered, it was so exciting because, you know, and now there are more photos now, right? But it was just really exciting. And you know, because, you know, I had written a number of stories, but we just didn't have any images at all. And so you know, that was really exciting. And then, you know, you're thinking about a cover. And so anyway, so that was really exciting. The story, I don't know if you guys know, I wrote a story about the photo, and it's it was just I don't know, it was a great story. It was a short story, but it was a powerful story to me. It really resonated with me. He the folks who you know, who ended up enslaving him and he ended up working for, in the album, described him you know, recalling when the stars fell. There was this meteor shower that was people wrote about, newspapers wrote about, and it was just a very powerful, evocative thing. So anyway, it just stayed with me. And then they were thinking about a cover, and it's just in addition to my own attachment to the story of Frank Campbell, it's a beautiful image. It's a beautiful image. So we were looking around, and by then there are other images too, and you guys have seen them, some of the other images, but that one personally resonated with me. And I reached out to Earlene. I said, Earlene, I think, you know, they're thinking about it for the cover. What do you think? She was like, oh yes. So that's kind of how we ended up there.
And then, of course, he has a connection to the Mahoney family.
And he does.
Yeah, so I guess that's just an extra, a little bit of lagniappe, as we say down in Louisiana. Carla, do you want to ask your question now?
Sure, thank you so much. My name is Carla Wills, from Baltimore, but my family's mostly from Southern Maryland, and I connect with Yorkshire, Butlers, and others. My question kind of extends from something you said earlier, and we've been talking about how this really is so much more than the GU 272 and Georgetown University. I'm wondering from this work, what's your experience been with how open the Catholic Church has been in accepting and acknowledging new information regarding its involvement in Jesuit enslavement and enslavement beyond the GU 272 in Louisiana? Because it seemed like when this, became public, their public stance was, okay, we've done this is terrible, and we're going to make moves, we're going to form this committee, we're going to do all these things. And then it seemed like they wanted to shut the door on that part of this history. Are they open to this new information about how far beyond this their involvement has been?
I think that so I always say that, institutions are never as forthcoming as journalists would like them to be, ever, because we like everything. I would say that, initially, so with the Jesuits initially, there was the provincial, when the story first ran, Hussey, they were not at that time, they were not very they wanted to engage very, very little with me. I mean, they would respond to emails and statements and issue statements and stuff like that, but I think as time went by, they they became more forthcoming, and certainly with the Jesuit conference was more that's Father Tim Kosecki, when he was president of the Jesuit conference, was much more much more willing to engage with me. But you guys know that it took a letter to, there were these talks about a foundation, there were all these things happening, and it took folks writing to Rome and saying, everyone's saying something's going to happen, but nothing's happening. And even with the agreement that the Jesuits made with the group of descendants with the foundation, as you know, last year, Joe Stewart wrote another letter to Rome saying, what's happening? People said that they were going to raise money. It's moving too slowly, and what's happening? So I think, and in fact, in that letter, it was clear that he believed that there were folks who within the order that didn't want to do this, that there were folks who did, and there were folks who didn't, and that was making it harder, for this to move forward. I've told the story that I think it was in 2017 or 2018 when I got an anonymous email from someone within Georgetown saying, there are more boxes of records here, and they don't want you to know about these records. And again, I don't know whether that is entirely true or not, that they didn't want me to know, but it is true that that person was the first person to tell me about those records, and that there were those records. And those records were important because the consensus was that, at least with the 1838 sale anyway, that the Jesuits never got all the money, that they got the down payment, and then these guys had financial problems, and that they never, they didn't get the money. But these boxes of records, where a lot of them were just financial ledgers, and what they showed was year by year by year by year the money coming in, because, as we know, they sold people to folks in Maryland too, and those people bought people on the installment plan, and they paid, every year the money was coming in. So you know, the Archdiocese of Baltimore just this year made an announcement saying that they were going to create a commission on slavery. And so we'll have to see kind of what comes of that. And Loyola and some of the institutions, Loyola University is also created, and some of the folks in this meeting right now have been working with Loyola to dig into its history too. So I think the truth is that as a number of institutions across the country are trying to, whether they're municipalities or other institutions, are trying to kind of wrestle with this history. Georgetown and the Jesuits actually, a lot of people feel like they stand out in having kind of, taken some steps here that are notable steps, but I think almost everybody who's sitting here would say, well, there's more to be done. And I think in terms of the folks in Maryland, I think particularly there's more to be done. And for folks who are researching families, I would mention too that many of you know Melissa Ruffner, who works with Richard Cellini on the Georgetown Memory Project. Judy Riffle specialized in Louisiana. Melissa Ruffner specialized in Maryland, and there are some books which honestly I couldn't get through all of them. There's a book in St. Mary's County which all it is just the slave sales. It's just years and years and years and years of names and money, and there's just a lot more work to be done by institutions. And I would say also too that, even before I started on this, working on Michelle Obama's family, I'd say we have to like as a mother, a daughter, a sister, I feel the urgency for my family too. Like, I feel like we can't wait. So the institutions need to do more. I think we can't wait for that. Like we ourselves need to do, because if we don't do it, then it won't get done. So I always I like to say I like to preach the gospel of genealogy, and everyone should be talking to the oldest members of their families right now, gathering those records and stuff like that. I need to do that, honestly. I think to myself in a panic sometimes, oh my gosh, I need to talk to Aunt so and so. Anyway, that's a little longer than what you were looking for, but
not at all. That was perfect. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, thanks. Dante, I think this is a good place for your question.
Good evening, Rachel. Good to talk with you again.
Dante, I just want to say hi. Hey.
Yeah. It's been a while, but it's
been
good.
So nice to see people. Yeah.
My question for you is, how has this work, the research of the 272, how has it impacted you personally?
Yeah, a lot of people ask me that, and I would say a couple of things. One is that it is such difficult but powerful and important work. It's like I said, when I said it felt urgent, even though nobody thought it was urgent, but I felt like, and I still do. I just feel like so how do I feel personally? I feel like I feel tremendously like the fact that these records are there. Sometimes they're scattered all over the place, and it's difficult, but just being able to do the work is enormously satisfying. It feels like I said, urgent and enormously satisfying. It's also really hard. There have been times when you read something and you just have to stop you know, and many of you know this because you have you've been doing this kind of research yourself, and you feel like, wow, I just have to put that down and, you know, close my eyes and take a breath. You know, I remember when I was writing the section about them coming for you know, to St. Inigo's, you know, and I two things I remember. One is that I remember realizing late in the game that actually, you know, Louisa and Anna's older brother had been taken earlier. Like he had been taken on the Uncas in like June. And I thought, oh my God, like this family is it's the worst possible thing. Like people are being torn apart, you know, it's like how many cuts, you know, and knowing that it wasn't over. And when I was writing that section about them coming, I honestly felt like it was the craziest thing on my kitchen table, you know, feeling like, oh my gosh, I want to yell across time, you know, run, you know, it's amazing, you know, it affects you, you know. You can't help but read the stuff and think about, you know, yourself. I've told people that with my son, I've said to him, you know, I think a lot about how it was that Louisa escaped and Anna and her sisters didn't, you know. Now they had young children, you know, like, and imagine, you know, having a split second to run, and what do you do? What do you do? You know, so it is difficult, but you know, I just feel like it's really important. And then what I say to, you know, about being Black and Catholic, I'm so, you know, thousands of people left the church, and I could certainly understand why. I didn't even know that segregation, I'm from New York. I didn't know that segregation exists. You'll laugh at me, right? I had no idea that the Catholic Church was a segregated church. So people left, but the people who stayed, and I remember when I realized, oh my goodness, when I learned about, you know, these nuns, you know, in this family, and that they were, you know, running schools, and, you know, Sister Mary Austin establishing, you know, the first, you know, overseas mission. I mean, and you know, and lay people too, you know, running you know, Sunday schools and parochial schools, and all the, you know, you know, the organizations and stuff. And I, you know, as a Black woman, as a Black Catholic, you know, I could see that they were pressing the institution to change. And that, you know, descendants, many of you, right? Some Catholics, some not, but those who stayed in the church also pressing still, you know, for change. And that inspired me, you know, and still inspires me.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
We're going to take Gwen next, and then after that, we'll take some questions from the YouTube chat. Gwen, you could ask your question now.
Hi, Rachel, this is Gwen Yates. I am a descendant. Well, my mom is matching a lot of the Mahoney descendants and Butlers and Yorkshires and everyone else. So I still haven't found the connection yet. But my question to you is, do you plan on writing any other stories about other families in the GU 272? And have you thought about becoming a genealogist and helping people make discoveries with their connections?
So, you know, I am thinking, you know, there are so many, there's so many stories. Like I said, particularly those Civil War pension records were so useful. I mean, just so interesting. I may do another story about a couple that I learned about, you know, through the pension records. And after that, you know, I don't know. You know, I've still got to figure out kind of what I'm going to do next. I have thought about, like, would it be, you know, journalism is a very unstable business, you know, and I used to joke, I need a plan B, you know. Teaching is my plan B, but I have thought that, you know, I have kind of I have helped people informally, you know, just people I know who you know, I could find, you know, some things, and it's always been so meaningful to them. So it's a good idea. I could certainly use you know, I love the work, and I'd love to learn even more about, you know, the kinds of records that are out there. So who knows? Not sure yet.
Thank you. Okay, coming from our YouTube chat from Sister R. Calloway, as there is an ongoing initiative of universities studying slavery, have you received any interest from this sector?
Mm-hmm. And I guess interest is well, so yes, I mean, a number of you know, Harvard is doing some work on this, and I've spoken to folks there. The folks at Loyola, you know, I found, you know, records, and have been in conversations with them. I shared some of the records that I found with them as they're kind of doing their work. St. Louis University, which, you know, there's a whole other, I mean, the Jesuits out west, I mean, that's you know, I just was dealing with Maryland, the Maryland Jesuits, but that slaveholding experience, I think there is one of the researchers out there is working on a book, but St. Louis University also reached out to me asking, and I may end up going out to speak to them about my work. So I think, and then there are the other institutions that benefited, but not directly, you know, with financial payments, but, you know, we had, you know, leaders from Maryland, Jesuits from Maryland who served on their faculties, or the Maryland Jesuits trained people. Boston College, Fordham, St. Joe's all fall into that category. Santa Clara does too in California. I mean, Holy Cross obviously benefited directly from it. And I did hear from a professor from Holy Cross as well, who's interested in perhaps doing more there.
Thank you. And then coming from Ronald Sims in the chat, he wants to know if there are any efforts underway to digitize those, I guess he's meaning those boxes of records at Georgetown, and who would fund such an effort?
So Georgetown actually very helpfully has been has been digitizing a lot of the records. They, you know, it's not as fast as probably they would like, certainly not as fast as I would like, but, you know, the Georgetown Slavery Archive exists, right? That's Adam Rothman's project. But even beyond that, you know, they are working to digitize stuff that is, you know, just in the like that you could just go into the library system online and see a lot of these records, financial records, all kinds of letters. They have been doing a lot of work. It's made things a lot easier, and I think they are. And the question about funding is a real one, because it does take funding to do this work, and I'm not sure. To be honest with you, I'm not sure, you know, I assume it's the university that has allocated funds to do this, but I'm not sure about that. But I can say that process is underway.
Thank you. Another question we have from our Zoom group is, will your book be placed in Catholic bookstores for sale?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I you know, I think it depends. I would hope so. I would hope so, you know, but I don't know. I'm not sure.
Okay, well, thank you. And again, I just want to remind everyone, if you're on YouTube, you can put your question in the chat. And if you're a part of our Zoom group, you can text your question to me. So here's another question. How many plantations did you find documentation of for Henry Johnson. I noticed that in the book, it primarily focuses on Henry Johnson, even though Henry Johnson and Jesse Beatty purchased people. And most of us are aware of Henry Johnson's plantation in Ascension Parish. I think that's when a lot of the descendants found out about it. But your book tells some additional stories.
He had a lot of plantations, a lot of them. He had plantations in St. James Parish, Lafourche Parish. I probably didn't. I probably did not capture, all of the plantations that he had. He was buying and selling people. I mean, he was mortgaging people. I mean, some of them are, people who, we don't think had a connection to the Jesuits. They were people that he purchased in other ways, but he had multiple plantations. I actually, in the end, couldn't be specific. I think because I wasn't convinced that I knew all of them. I wasn't. We do believe that he, this 1835, we talk about the small sales that he did end up with some of those people who were sold in the 1830s. But you're absolutely right that Jesse Beatty, in fact, the first story that I wrote, in 2016 was dealing with, Jesse Beatty and his plantations. So yeah, the two of them had a number of properties.
Okay. And I don't want to give too much away in the book, but it's the saga about the Mahoney family. And some of the Mahoney family remained in Maryland and some came to Louisiana. What was it like when you realized how they were separated even in Louisiana?
Yeah, I mean, that's just, the promise was that what the priests kept saying as they tried to justify this was that they were going to sell people to Louisiana where there would be big plantations so that, families would stay together, that they wouldn't run the risk of them being sold. They said, oh, if we sell them in Maryland, there are smaller farmers here, and then we'd have to break up families. So this is the best option. But the truth is that, Henry Johnson, and even and Beatty too, for different reasons, Beatty dies in 1852, I think, and so the people who he had are purchased again, and Henry Johnson runs into all kinds of financial difficulties. So he has partnerships, sells half of his plantation, gets into these partnerships where someone manages it, he's a partner, and then finally gets out of it altogether. I just thought to myself about those families, you're about just, and again, there's no way that we could ever imagine what it's like, but to be sold in 1838 and to have to live with that fear of this happening over and over again, it's just but that was the reality. And it's not just the reality that the folks enslaved by the Jesuit faced. This was American slavery, right?
Did you consider putting any family trees, especially the Mahoney family tree, in the book?
So it's an interesting question. With Michelle Obama's book, I did. And I didn't this time. Maybe for the paperback we will. It's probably a good idea.
Especially considering the separations.
Yeah.
I would think it would give a good visual for people to see the tree and the name.
To see that,
and where they all ended up. Because it's such a tragic story, but it is the story of slavery, right? Families are separated.
That's absolutely right.
And the Mahoney family definitely epitomizes the depths of that separation. Yeah. When I realized the separation, I mean, my heart still hurts. That, my children, my grandchildren's ancestors. It was just it's painful. I'm going back to Henry Johnson's The Many Plantations of Henry Johnson. You mentioned that his plantation in St. James Parish was near a Catholic school. Do you recall the name of that school?
Mhm. So it was right on the border of a Catholic church, and there was a convent that was there. I think it was Sacred Heart, I believe. I'll have to get back to you on that, but I believe that's what it was.
Because on one of our calls a couple of years ago, we had a nun on our call who was researching the people that her order enslaved. And
yeah.
and so it was the Sacred Heart group, but their church.
It was Sacred Heart.
Right. So it was
Okay.
the St. Michael's School, but the order was in the guest, please help me if you have the name exactly, but it was an order of something religious of the Sacred Heart. That was the order, religious of the
yeah.
And in Convent, Louisiana, which is in St. James Parish. And so I'm visualizing, so Henry Johnson had a plantation near the school. I'm like, okay, now I need to go do some more research, because
right. And there well may be connections. And I think that Richard Cellini at one point was trying to see whether there were DNA connections between some of those families, and I don't know where and the families enslaved by the Jesuits, because I think maybe I forget if there were names that were similar, whether they had some of the same names. I don't remember, but it's definitely worth again, another really interesting avenue worth pursuing.
and because so much of what we're doing is trying to make those connections on our Thursday calls, all of these different locations are so important.
That's right.
And so every time we can call the names of them, it's a good thing. And even all of the different Jesuit schools throughout the country, people can look in the records around
right.
those schools and see where the different sisters owned people. If
Right.
'cause a lot of the sisters owned, they were near the sisters had
Right.
the Jesuit schools.
Right. That certainly was the case with Visitation, right? The Georgetown Visitation Sisters in DC, who had, ties to the Jesuits, and some of those names, I mean, they owned some families that had similar names. Like I think there were Mahonies that they owned, or other families that had similar, that seemed clear. Like, again, I think they said that the slave trader that they relied on was a relative of, one of the priests. So, they often, I think, used the same pool of people. It's and one thing I would say too is that, one of the things that's been so interesting, and I think and powerful, that I did not anticipate when I started researching this, was just just all of you. Like I never imagined that there would be so many descendants, or that that you guys would be doing this work of repairing what was torn apart. I mean, that's really something, to see. I don't think I imagined that.
I guess we would have been a good source of research for your book.
Oh, and people have been, very much so.
I mean, just coming on one of the Thursday calls, because
Yes.
this has been going on every Thursday for the last 3 years, and will continue for as long as there's interest. I think we probably, in terms of connecting families together, because
Yeah.
people are still figuring out their connections to each other and to this history. And you know, it's never a dull moment. You
Yeah.
know, when
I
we
want to
go ahead.
I want to say something. I see that Shelby Cohen asked about the book. I'm gonna Shelby. So and Kevin, yes, St. Mary's County. I have it written down somewhere, so I will look it up. It's I forget it's like something conveyances of, but I'll look it up and I will I'll email Karen so that she can share that with you. I honestly, it sounds really, really interesting. Like I think we found, for instance, in there that Arnold Jones, who is Anna's husband, you know, had been captured and escaped again. And also that and Jeremy, if Jeremy's here, you know, so and actually there's, you know, his brother, because Jeremy, you found that that record of that, you know, the wanted ad of when they were looking for Arnold and his brother. There's a reference in, I think, that came from that book that said that they believed that Moses got to New York, for instance, which it's not even in the book, but it's like, oh wow, like he got, you know, like there's a lot of stuff. So I'll share that it's the name of that book with Karen.
And in reading the book, I could hardly tell where just straight factual research ended, where maybe some artistic license came in, and then where some slave, I'm assuming some slave narrative played a part, because I saw some quotations that may have come from the voice of an enslaved person. And so when I talk about artistic license, I mean, I just got such a sense of the closeness of the relationship between Anna and Louisa. And unless you were reading their diary, it's like, how did you just blend all that together? Did you have actual diaries, or whether it was from, I mean, even some of Henry Johnson's information seemed like it just came from, like, it's like it came from his voice. And some of the narratives, I saw it in quotation marks in the book, so I assumed that was slave narratives, but I just felt the connection between Anna and Louisa. How that all came together.
So yeah, no artistic license. There's more, or at least not in my books anyway. There's more of there is a movement. You know, some of you may have read like Tia Miles's book about the SAC, which won a lot of awards. And you know, there are a number of scholars who are saying that, you know, the archive, in a way, because Black people were silenced, the archive, and relying on it, you know, kind of perpetuates that silence, because, you know, and that it is therefore useful to to use our imaginings, you know. Of course I imagine, but I can't, if I'm imagining, I'm going to tell you I'm imagining, because I can't, I'm a journalist still. So I hear, I understand why people are concerned about the archive and how it perpetuates some of this silence and erasure, which it does. But what I try to do is, again, like as a writer, I really want to bring you there. So I use all kinds of devices to do that. So for instance, there are very, very little in the way of voices from and you know, any of the folks enslaved by the Jesuits. So I use contemporaneous voices, like, you know, slave narratives, and anything that from enslaved people, similarly situated enslaved people. So I scoured the narratives for enslaved people from Maryland and Louisiana, and where I found narratives that, you know, described something that, you know, the families were experiencing. You know, I described this person who said that, you know, this is what it felt like when that happened to him. With Louisa and Anna, I mean, there are some things that you could. I also used the documents to be able to describe like things that bring you closer to it, like weather, also maps that describe the plantation, so that I could say that if you're walking down this Moberly, the brother who was a terrible racist. I mean, boy, was he, in the late 18 teens and until the enslaved people were able to oust him. He has some very detailed descriptions of St. Inigo's in terms of the plants that were there. He has a map so that you could see where the slave quarters were, and then the blacksmiths was here, and then the stables were here. So, I could describe for you, like if you were walking down this path, you would pass the peach orchards, or you would pass this. The almanacs talk about the weather. In 1834, there was, the Potomac, froze up, where Milady writes about that, so I really tried that. And the girls ended up naming their firstborns after each other, right? So that told me that, they were close. And then I looked for, again, accounts of children, these two girls, the youngest in this family, accounts of children and the kinds of games that enslaved girls and children played. And I wove those together to try and, to bring you there.
It brought me there.
I'm glad.
I'm like, wait a minute, how does she know that?
Mm-hmm.
Another question from the YouTube chat. Let's see, the references you mentioned tonight, are they cited in your book?
Yes, I have almost 100 pages of citations, actually. So, I mean, let me just see if it is from, hold on. From page 237 to page 299. So about 70 pages of citations. So because I felt like this is really important and leads me to kind of what the next project I want to do is, because I think, there's a lot of stuff that we don't know. There's a lot of stuff we won't ever know. But there's a lot of stuff we know. And I want to make sure that people know at least what I was able to rely on. And the next project that I am working on is trying to create a digital archive of, a lot of these records that exist for a number of institutions, not just the Catholic Church, not just Georgetown, not just universities, but banks, insurance companies. I really would like to make more of these records accessible so that, scholars, journalists, writers, families, people can see and have access to these records. So yeah, I cite a lot.
And we're soon coming up on the end of the YouTube portion of this call. So if there's one last burning question from the YouTube chat, please put it in the chat now. And then I'll ask my last question of Rachel, which you began to allude to. You must have known I was near the end of my questions. I was going to ask, what is next for you? And is there anything next related to the history of Jesuit enslavement?
So I told you a little bit about what my next project is, which is, this broader project about contemporary institutions that have grown out of slavery. One thing that I actually should mention to you guys, which is a bit of a work in progress, but it might be the kind of thing that we could. I believe in like crowdsourcing and sharing information because people know so many different things, and we're stronger sometimes as researchers if we pool our resources a bit. Just again, thinking about the 1838 sale and how much focus there has been on that, I started putting together trying to put together a list of all the people who had been bought or sold by the Jesuits, because there are a lot of names that there are a lot of smaller sales, individuals, a handful of people here and there. and they are named in records. And I've thought to myself, okay, well, we know the 272, but like we know too that there were, we have that sale document, but we know, from the 1700s, we know that people were bought and sold and their names exist, and that it would be useful to have like a spreadsheet where it's, year by year, it shows, as best we can tell, the year that a person was bought or sold, who the buyer or seller was, the name of the person, as best we know, and any family members of that person, who were sold with or who remained, and the plantation. And so I've started work on that, and I think that would be, in terms of the work on Jesuit slaveholding, that would be the next thing that I would like to kind of continue working on.
And actually, that brings me to a question I had, was a listing of the 272. Did you consider adding that to the book? Obviously, it's going to be so much more dynamic digitally, but did you consider adding that to the book? A listing of all those from that, that
oh, you mean, just literally the sale document?
Mhm.
I think there's a picture, let me just see. I think there's a picture in the book. It's a photo
Mhm.
of Kaseki holding it, holding holding the list. So it's in there in that way.
And I'm always thinking about families trying to connect the dots and seeing the name
Yes.
printed. But I will tell people, you can go to the Georgetown Slavery Archives, and there is that
Right.
list there. And I'm assuming that that's one of the references in the book as well.
Oh yeah, that's a great resource.
Yes, and because people will forever be trying to connect their family history to the history of Jesuit enslavement. And so I just want to thank you for joining us. But before we leave our YouTube audience, was there any one last thing you wanted to make sure that people got from you before we close out this portion?
No, like I just wanted to say again, thank you so much, for those of you who I have met over the years, for those of you who I haven't, but just thank you. Like I said, it's been such a privilege to do this research and to this work, and to feel free to reach out. If I've said something here that you thought, oh, wait a second, now I need that one, to please feel free to reach out, and really I'm happy to share whatever I know, whatever can be helpful, because I know, again, this is about family, and that's really important.
Well, thank you so much, Rachel. And if you all think that you may be related to any of the descendants of Jesuit enslavement, please reach out to us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and of course, right here on YouTube. It will be either Descendants of Jesuit Enslavement or Jesuit Enslaved. And if you have additional questions or comments, please leave them in the comments section on YouTube. And thank you, everyone who has joined us on YouTube in the chat. And good night. We will continue in our regular Zoom call.